Hi, I'm Charlene Jorgensen and welcome to Quilting from the Heartland. Today I'm going to show you how to make a pineapple log cabin quilt. Now remember last week I showed you how to make the traditional log cabin block, and we're going to use those same shapes today to build the pineapple quilt. Also last week I showed you how to build many different quilts using this same block, as well as the little chicken pin cushion, which was really fun to do. But today, like I said, we're going to turn it into a pineapple design, and the only difference between the traditional log cabin block and the pineapple design is we have these little folded squares in the corner which give it the dimension. Now the size of this quilt, of course, can be changed by the number of rounds that you put into each of the block. You can make something as small as a Christmas ornament like this, and this one doesn't have as many rounds as this one. This one would be a coaster, or like I said, you can build a little tiny Christmas ornament. So we have a lot of options when working with this idea that I'm going to show you today. The feature quilt, which is on the back wall in the studio, is built up of total scraps. This is a perfect way to use up all the crumbs in your sewing room. The palette in this quilt has all muted colors. The fabrics all have gold overtones. They all portray the same mood. There is a variety of texture in the quilt, as you can see. And because the logs are so small, we have quilted in the ditch around each of the blocks. The outside edge of the quilt is framed with two borders, and you'll notice that we have a touch of red along the outside edge, and it's very narrow, just as if you would frame a border or put a border on a picture. And then the outside edge, I found a perfect ending for this quilt. It has a fabric which actually resembles a woven rug like you would have seen at Grandma's house. The cross-hatching in the border, which was, by the way, machine quilted, repeats the diagonal lines that are created by the pineapple design within the quilt. Now the quilt on the back wall has mostly dark or all dark in the background, and the pineapples are made up of the light triangles. And the quilt that I'm showing you on the front table has a light background with the dark squares in the corner. So you really can do it either way. The size of the quilt, like I said, is determined by the number of blocks you put in the row, and then of course the number of rows that you put into your quilt. This one, of course, is very small, and it's used mostly for decorating around the house. It looks cute with a teddy bear holding it or whatever. You could even make nice little placemats or something as small as coasters, or go on and cover a queen-size quilt or a queen-size bed, whatever you want to do. For the shapes for cutting today, I am going to use the log cabin templates, which you see off to the right over here. And these are the logs that we're going to build the whole quilt with. On the back side of all of the templates, I have put little fabric grips, and that keeps them from sliding when I'm cutting on the fabric. Ahead of time, I have laid 6 layers of fabric up on top of the board. And like I said, this is a perfect quilt to use up scraps in, so you'll see that we have quite a variety of widths of fabric on top of each other. And I'm going to straighten all 6 of these fabrics at one time. So I will lay the ruler up on top of all 6 layers of fabric, and I'll use a rotary cutter to do all of my cutting for the quilts, and I prefer working with a small rotary cutter. And when I hold the cutter, I hold it like this to open it, push it forward, and then I rest my pointer finger up on top of it, and that gives me control of the cutter. The first cut I make, I always go backwards and then forward. And we will now straighten all 6 layers of fabric at one time. Make sure you close the blade before you lay it down. And now we'll remove the ruler, and we'll bifold all the fabric up on top of the board, and we won't disturb the fabric when I do that. And then I'll be ready to cut the strip that I needed. Now the center of the block can start out with either a light square or a dark square. Now this one has the light square in the center, and the one that I showed you earlier had the dark squares in the center. So I'm going to cut many of those first for the center. And we'll start out with template K, and that one has a 1.5 inch strip that we need for template K. So you'll line up the straightened edge of the fabric with the 1.5 inch line on the ruler, and we'll cut 6 strips at one time. Then remove the extra fabric. And then I like to move these strips onto a small mat board. And notice that we have 2 colors of mat board to work from. I like to work on the side that makes the fabric show up better, so I'll flip it over to the light side, bifold the fabric up on top of the mat board, and that makes it very easy to turn it around. Lay the template up on top. Now each time I cut one of these squares, I will have 6 of them at one time. And you just work your way across that strip, each time getting 6 more. And I won't cut the whole thing, but you see how easy it is to cut up many little pieces at one time. And as I get them cut from all the different scraps, I would put them into a transparent envelope until I'm ready to start sewing. Then I would just go on to each of the groups of fabric and continue cutting until I have a strip from all of the scraps that I'm going to use in this quilt. The other piece that I'm going to show you how to cut today is for the logs that are used in this quilt, and notice that there are many different logs used in this design. So we'll move this over and we'll get ready to cut all of the logs. Now ahead of time I have washed all of the fabric, dried it in the dryer, and then I like to starch my fabric before I start cutting. And when I starch my fabric, I use a mixture of 50% water and 50% Stay Flow. And I spritz all the fabric down and I fold it up into a bag until the moisture evenly distributes throughout the fabric, and then I iron it dry. So I put some sizing back into the fabric. When getting ready to straighten the fabric for the logs, I will match the selvage edges up, and then I will hang it out straight so that it hangs nice, and then I'm going to lay it down on the mat board, and we'll bifold it so that everything is laying up on top of the mat board. That way it's much easier to keep it from being disturbed. And again, we'll straighten the fabric first. Now we have all these different logs to work from, and we won't cut all of them, but what you'll do is cut the strip to accommodate the length of the log rather than the width. So what I'm going to do is lay the log down on top of the ruler, and I'll match the edge of the template with the straightened edge of the fabric to cut the strip. And again, we'll remove it. And like we did before, we'll move up onto a small mat board. Now, if you were going to do a larger quilt, you would probably put 6 strips on top of each other, so you would save a lot of time. And again, work your way across that strip until you've used them all up. Now I forgot to mention that the seam allowance is included in the templates, so you don't have to worry about that. They're transparent too, and I'll show you how to do some fussy cutting. Now what you would do is you would continue on until you've used up all the logs that are used in the design, and then like I did with the other pieces, I would put them into a transparent envelope until I was ready to start sewing. Before I go to the sewing machine, I'm going to show you how to do some fussy cutting. And remember the little ornament I showed you had the little Santa Claus in the center of the ornament. And because the template is transparent, I could lay the template down on top of the fabric, find the little face in the center of the template, and then just cut around it. And of course you could only do one at a time, but that's how I was able to place the little Santa Claus in the center of the Christmas ornament. And do remember that you have to allow for the seam allowance in there, so you want the motif to be small enough to allow for the seam allowance. Now these logs will finish off at 1/2 inch in width when we have the block sewn. So each of these logs within the block are only 1/2 inch wide. These strips themselves, or the width of them, start out at 1 inch. After I have done all of the cutting and I start getting ready to sew, I do all of my design work on a flannel board. It makes it so much easier to see if you're going to like the project when it's finished. Even though it's scraps, I still take the time to lay it all out on the flannel board. We're going to start sewing in the center of the block today, and when we get to the sewing machine, I'll take you through the process of building the whole block. Well, now I think we're ready to go to the sewing machine and start putting the block together. We're going to sew all of our seams today with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm pretty lucky that I'm able to sit down at a machine that has the scant 1/4 inch seam allowance already programmed into it. I am already in the quilting window on the sewing machine, and I just touched the scant 1/4 inch and I will be ready to start sewing. I will be using cotton thread to do all my sewing because it matches the fabric for content as well as strength. When you look up at the flannel board, I'm going to show you the steps first that we're going to go through in building the quilt. We'll start out in the center and we'll add the B log to the K, and we will chain sew some of those together, and then we'll go on and add the C log to the top of the block, so you'll have something like this, and then we'll add another C over here, and then we'll go down and we'll make one complete round around that block. Then we will start adding the next round with the little folded squares underneath, and that's how we start to get the pineapple design. And then the seams will be pressed to one side. Actually, when I back up here, all the seams are pressed open on the first round, and then when we get to the second round, I start pressing the seams to one direction. And then we'll continue working our way around the block, and like I said earlier in the program, remember that the number of rounds determine the size of the block. We just keep working our way around that block until you have the size that you wanted. So like I said, we'll start out by chain sewing, and ahead of time I have already got some little squares down in front of me. I didn't cut all of them today, but notice how I have many different colors to pick from down in front of me. And when you look at the quilt up in front of me here, you'll see that the center starts out with a different color all the time. So that's kind of another way to use up many little scraps. So we'll start out by chain sewing the little pieces together. And I like to work with an anchor cloth in the beginning, and an anchor cloth is just simply a piece of fabric folded in half, and I send it through the machine first. And I don't do any back stitching when I do the quilting. At least I, for the most part, try to avoid it because it creates bulk in the corners, and you don't want that. Now, to get this perfect scant 1/4 inch, I will have the fabric following the edge of the foot, and I didn't use any pins. I'm just going to guide the fabric with the stiletto, each time picking up a different color for the center. And I'll do all the pinning with the stiletto. Then after you have put the bees on, then we'll go and add the next piece on. The seam allowance was pressed open, and then the next log is put on, which was the C. And you need to take a sewing test when you're sewing, and if the C is too long or too short, that means that your seam allowance was inaccurate. So you want to have the next log to match the piece that you're adding on. So now we'll jump to the next part. We will finger press this seam open, and when you finger press, you run your pointer finger down the seam line to move that fabric open. And then press it always with the iron before you go on to the next step. See how nice and flat that lays? Now we'll be ready to go to the next log, and if you don't know for sure which one it is, just hold your patchwork up here and find the next log and work your way around that block. Now I'll pick the next part off the flannel board, which has gone all the way around the block. See, we started over here with the B, and then we put the C on and the D, and when you turn it to the back side, you'll see that all the seams have been pressed open and they lay very nice and flat. Now we're ready to start adding that first group of color on, and we have already added a couple of pieces on to this one, and then I'll finger press that seam in one direction, and again, like I did before, press it with the iron before you continue on. Now, sometimes it's easy to be confused in which direction to sew or which piece to add on. The rule that I follow is that the next log goes on to the part that has the two seams to cross over. So what we'll do now is we'll take one of these folded squares that we've done ahead of time. In fact, I need to show you how I folded those. You just take one square, finger press it first, and then what I did was I hold it in place with the stiletto and then come with the iron so that you don't burn yourself. And then take from the little squares that you have already ironed ahead of time, pick a color that would look good, just hold it in place, but we got to put it over here because we have to get the right piece. Then pick the next log that you're going to add and leave that little folded piece inside. And you're ready to sew. Now if you're not comfortable doing it this way, you might want to pin it down, but I'm going to just hold it in place with my thumb and then guide it with the stiletto. And see how these two pieces match up perfectly. They wouldn't match up if I had an inaccurate seam allowance. And if you start out wrong in the beginning, your problem just grows bigger every time you add the next log. So look inside here and make sure you've got the pieces lined up, and they are. And because I'm not working on many pieces at one time, I'd probably sew off onto another anchor cloth. Actually, I like to work with 2 anchor cloths all the time anyway. Okay, now when you open it up, you see how the design is starting to grow a little bit. Again, finger press that seam so it goes outward, and press it before you add the next piece. Now I think some green might look good in the corner. And then we'll find the next log, which would be this one. Put it up on top. It's really fun to build these. I find it to be very relaxing to build this quilt. And it's also fun to see your scraps getting used up into something that looks so good when it's finished. We'll find our little anchor cloth. See how this block is starting to come alive? We've only got one log left to add to this round. And then we have made it around this particular block 2 complete times. We'll just tuck those in there with the stiletto, hold it in place, okay, that is one completed round. And now what you would do is continue to add the next group of triangle or folded squares and continue working your way around that block until you have gone all the way around, actually 3 complete times. And the last thing that you do is sew 1/8 of an inch from the edge of each block. And look at here how we have held all of the pieces or the little folded squares in place. Then after you have done that, you start building your rows. And the fun part comes when you start laying them out. You twist and turn them to get the color in the right place. And then of course it's time to start sewing them into rows. And when you sew them into rows, you match up the edges like this. And what I do then is I'll fold this backwards like this and match up the 2 folds, and then I stick a pin diagonally in this area to hold those 2 together, and I do the same over here. I'll make a fold, match up the 2 folded squares, and again put a pin to hold them in place. That way I will end up with the perfect match right in this area right in here. And like I said earlier, the size of the quilt is determined by the number of blocks that you put in a row, or the width, I mean, is determined by the number of blocks in a row. Okay, now we'll sew these 2 together. Something else that is so neat about this machine is that it has a pressure sensitive foot, and it feels the density of the fabric that I'm sewing over. And so because of that, it doesn't push my fabric forward as I'm sewing. And again, we will sew onto an anchor cloth, and we'll show you one of these. See how nicely those match up in here? And that was because of the way that we pinned them. And I would finger press this seam open at this point now, and that way I would have a nice flat surface to quilt on the right side. When I get to the finishing touches, I would use a low loft batting for the inner part of the quilt, and like I said, I stitched in the ditch around each of the rows because the pieces were too small. And other than that, I would just suggest just having a good time creating your own pineapple log cabin quilt. I've had a lot of fun showing it to you today.